Today's Mercedes-Benz interview of the day brought to you by Mercedes-Benz. Celebrate the journeys that bring us closer together with an exclusive offer on a vehicle you'll adore. Mercedes-Benz Holiday Love Celebration going on now through January 2nd. Learn more at mbusa.com/special offers. He knows college football. He knows more than anybody else. He's Andy Staples, covers college football for On3 Sports. He was at the Georgia-Ole Miss game this past weekend. He's got duties at LSU versus Florida this weekend. First reaction to the college football rankings was what, Andy?
I was surprised they had Georgia as far down as they did. I actually thought they probably should do that, but was surprised they did do that. Now, obviously, it can work itself out because they've got Tennessee this weekend. If they beat Tennessee, they'll be right back up there. But I thought that was a pretty clear-headed view of what you saw in the Georgia-Ole Miss game, and they probably did what they should have. Now, there's some other things I wasn't particularly fond of. Like, I don't really understand why Miami and SMU are 5 spots apart when they're basically the same resume. Right? And that's a helmet logo thing, which, as someone who feels like that SMU pony logo is the best helmet logo, I don't feel like that helmet logo should be degraded like that by just saying, oh, Miami's a bigger brand, let's put them there. They're the same. They should be 1 spot apart.
Yeah, I know. I caution my listeners. I said, look, you're going to go apoplectic on this. You're going to see BYU, and they're, in the top 4 seeds, they're going to have a first-round bye. I mean, and they're going to host, like, this is going to bother people. SMU or Miami is going to have a first-round bye. Is this good for the playoffs?
I don't know if it's good for the playoffs because I also think if you have a misseeded team at number 4, it makes that 5 seed really valuable because that's who you play in the second. You will get the 12 seed, which may be a misseeded team. That could be the 5th highest ranked conference champ, which could be ranked 24 for all we know. I don't think it will be this year, but you could get the easiest first round game and possibly the easiest second round game. And I don't think that's how they wanted it to actually turn out. You want the number 1 seed to have the easiest path because you think they earned it. So I agree with you, Dan. I think there's a big awareness gap. There's a lot of folks who are just coming into it now that are going to be still surprised because I get it when I've been putting this bracketology thing out every week where I have what I think the bracket will look like at the end of the season. And I still get, how can you have BYU there? I'm like, okay, what Big 12 team would you like in their place? And the person's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, it's going to have to be one of those.
Yeah, that's what people don't realize is you got the automatic berths here. And just because you're ranked in the top 12 doesn't mean you're in the 12-team playoff. This is year 1. What kind of tweaks do you think we'll see with this?
I don't think we'll see any tweaks in year 2, but I think there's a chance of tweaks for year 3 because that's when the original TV contract runs out. So the original TV contract goes through next year. They still can make some changes. And the talk is that they're going to go to 14 teams for 2026. And the reason would be it's more to keep those conference championship games valuable. The SEC and the Big Ten want people to watch their conference championship games. They want them to matter. Well, if those are the only 2 buys, and they wouldn't write it that way, but realistically, the SEC champ and the Big Ten champ would be your number 1 and number 2. If they were the only people that could get buys, it would add stakes to those games. Like your ACC championship game, your Big 12 championship game, they're probably going to have pretty big stakes this year. Like it's probably winning in and the loser's out. So that's going to make those games really valuable television properties. But right now, this year, the 2 that get into the Big Ten and probably the 2 that get into the SEC, they're getting into the playoffs. So who cares?
Yeah, Georgia-Tennessee is like a playoff game.
It feels like it. And it's strange because you'd think if Tennessee loses, they're 10-2, they beat Alabama, there's still a chance they get in. It's not necessarily an elimination game for them, but it does feel like Georgia's out if they lose, just like it felt like last week, Georgia-Ole Miss. If Ole Miss were to lose, they'd be out.
If Army beats Notre Dame next week, ...
It will be wild because then you come down to the American Athletic Conference Championship, which is, we'll see who wins the Tulane-Navy game this week. Because you could have a really wild scenario where you have an Army-Navy game on Army's campus before the actual Army-Navy game in D.C. the following week. So it could be crazy. But yes, if Army were to beat Notre Dame and stay undefeated, one, Army's going to pop up in the rankings. Two, you have a really interesting scenario where, remember, it's the 5 highest ranked conference champs get into the playoff, not the Power 4 champs and somebody else. It's just the 5 highest ranked. So let's say the Big 12 eats itself. Let's say the ACC teams lose a few more games. Like, you could have a situation where one of those conferences is sweating getting a team into the bracket.
Oh. If I said to the committee, you could have Boise State or Army, which school is a better story for the playoffs?
Well, I think Army would be undefeated in that scenario. I don't think there's a scenario where there's a 1-loss Army that's up for it, because that loss is probably to Notre Dame. You need Army to beat Notre Dame, which, look, if you watch the Notre Dame Navy game, it's going to be very hard. Notre Dame's size up front is what allowed them to crush Navy. And in the service academies, you just don't have that size human, because they used to have weight limits. I don't think they still have the same thing, but they don't typically have a bunch of 300-pound guys. And that's the difficulty. But if Army could beat Notre Dame and Army goes undefeated, I mean, that's got to be the best story.
Yeah.
But I actually think a 12-1 Boise State, where the one loss is a very narrow one, tight game at Oregon, which is probably going to be your number 1 seed. That's what I'm saying about, if you're the Big 12 of the ACC, you don't want to see that.
Can Indiana lose to Ohio State and still make the playoffs?
Yes. I think at 11-1, Indiana still gets in, as long as they don't lose 65-0. But I do think they're getting it parsed pretty close with some of this glut of potential 10-2 SEC teams, because they're going to have the SEC teams are going to have better wins in that scenario. But the thing about Indiana is the way they've beaten people all season, even though their strength of schedule is not great, has been very impressive. I think the committee is going to take that into account. And as long as they're pretty competitive against Ohio State, I actually think that's going to be a very competitive game. I think they're going to be fine.
How does Colorado get in?
Colorado just keeps winning. If they keep winning, they're going to get in. Unless I had that disaster potential for the Big 12 with Boise State and Army, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, like, if you're Colorado, you are playing better than anybody in the Big 12 right now. You've just got to win your next 3 games and then win the Big 12 championship game. And I don't think that's a far-fetched possibility at all. They're going to be favored in their next 3 regular season games. Like I said, they are playing better than anybody in the Big 12 at the moment. And then it's probably them and BYU, one-shot deal in Jerry World. Hopefully the sun won't shine in anybody's eyes, and the winner goes.
Can you be the best player in college football and not win the Heisman if you're Travis?
Oh, it's happened
Travis
all the time. So, Dan, my first year as a Heisman voter was 2009. My number 1 was Ndamukong Suh. There was nobody better in college football than Ndamukong Suh that year. Mark Ingram won the Heisman. Mark Ingram was a great player. He probably wasn't even the best player on Alabama that year. Rolando McClain probably was. So, yes, that can definitely happen. You're asking a Travis Hunter question. I actually think, and this is a pleasant surprise to me, because at the beginning of the season, I said, if Travis Hunter does what he did last season, but at a higher level, and is playing every play on both sides of the ball, we absolutely seriously have to consider him for the Heisman Trophy. I would say he's the front runner now. And I think most voters are looking at this and saying, this is very special. This is something most of us have not seen this in our lifetimes, because the 2-platoon system came in 1965. But I don't even think the older folks saw this. There wasn't somebody this dominant on both sides of the ball, even in the 50s and 60s.
Well, remember when they would say to Charles Woodson, hey, you got to play a little offense here. Or
a little.
Like we were trying to make this story more compelling. And, Charles Woodson's one of the greatest college players of all time. But it felt like we were, universities were saying, hey, if you want to win the Heisman, how about you return some kicks? Like trying to get more attention to somebody.
Right. The closest we've seen to what Travis Hunter's doing is Chris Gamble when Ohio State won the national title in 2002. And he was really good on both sides of the ball. But that roster was so loaded with NFL talent, he didn't have to play the amount of plays that Travis Hunter does. Like we just haven't seen it. And we're never going to see this again. So cherish these moments here these next few weeks, because you're never going to see somebody do this again.
How did Michigan go from national champs to average?
Jim Harbaugh delayed his decision. Well, I mean, his decision was on the NFL's timeline, which is not on the transfer portal's timeline. So the time you would have spent figuring out who your quarterback was going to be, getting a quarterback out of the transfer portal if you didn't like what you had on your roster, which they didn't, all of that was wasted because they were waiting on Jim Harbaugh to decide if he was going to stay or leave. And so that was the issue. So I don't bang on Sharon Moore for the roster this year because he had really no chance to address it. What he does in this offseason will tell us a lot more.
Well, they're going to pony up. I mean, LSU ponied up for Jaden Daniels. They're going to pony up for this Underwood kid. And
they are, and they're also probably going to pony up for somebody out of the portal. So Dave Portnoy, the Barstool Sports founder, he's a proud Michigan grad, and he's like, look, I'll do 7 figures to get somebody out. So Bryce Underwood's the number 1 quarterback recruit in the class of 2025. The plan, I think, for Michigan is go get a big rental 1-year old guy quarterback. That's your starter. And then Bryce, if you can take him from LSU, which they're fighting tooth and nail for that, he'd be the developed guy.
I say you get Joe Flacco, you put him in for a year, and then...
and you let Anthony Richardson develop.
Yeah.
That'll work.
Yes. Great to talk to you as always. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Dan.
Love talking to Andy. Andy Staples covers college football for On3 Sports.